My name is Helene Zettner. I am one of Ricardo's colleagues in the CPGP division, overseeing different grants. I just recently, a year ago, ended the Mentally Ill Offender Crime Reduction Grant. If you guys remember those, I see some of the counties that may have had that grant. And now we're going to be doing the Prop 64 grant, which has to do with the local programs based on the legalization of marijuana and the tax on the sale and cultivation of. So that RFP won't come out for probably after the first of the year, but stay tuned. Always gonna, kind of plug my stuff too. So as Ricardo mentioned, we were talking about programs and really to reduce recidivism. That's why we're all here, not only to help serve our clients and participants in the programs, but to reduce their recidivism rates. So I just wanted to give a plug to the University of Cincinnati Corrections Institute. They're the ones that came out and trained Ricardo and I, and not sure if there's anybody else, my colleagues in the room, to actually go through programs and through the correctional programs checklist, look to make sure that they are doing the model and the intervention in which you chose for your certain population to Fidelity. And it covers 5 different domains, 80 some odd questions and indicators. And so this basically comes from their training, and that we're now going to pass along some of those golden nuggets to you. And as Ricardo said, if you were here last time as part of the first cohort, hopefully you get a new nugget out of this because there's a lot of information, and I am the only one standing between you and your afternoon break. So I am going to go through some of this as fast as possible, but also hit some key things. There's a lot of information on the slides, and I did that on purpose so that when you have a copy of it, it's there instead of a bunch of talking notes that you're like, well, what did she say about that slide? Or that was brilliant, and now I can't remember. I tried to put a lot on the slide. So even though there may be a lot of narrative, it was on purpose. So what we're going to do first is talk about evidence-based and really what it means. And there's 2 different types of evidence, and there's the anecdotal and the empirical. And so the anecdotal is the lowest form of evidence. It's stories, it's not based on any real data collection, and we've all kind of made decisions based on something empirically. Like you're always seeing those same individuals coming through your programs, and you're like, we have this really high need of these individuals. And that's anecdotal because you don't actually have the data that shows that, well, there are 1 or 2 high utilizers, but everybody else isn't really coming through the system as much. And they're just casual observations that you may make. Then there's empirical evidence, and that is everybody would agree and everybody sees the exact same thing because it's based on numbers and data. An example of this would be like reading a thermometer. It could be 78 degrees, and everybody can see that. So that is the data, 78 degrees. But everybody might feel the 78 degrees different, whether it's hot or it's cold, and that's subjective. But the thermometer still says exactly what it is as the data. And so you want to make sure that you're using programs and interventions that are not dependent on any one observer, but have been researched and the data shows the numbers. And we'll talk a little bit about fidelity to those programs here in a minute. Evidence-based strategies. If you want to think about that more, it's data-driven decision-making. It's not just seeing someone and saying, oh, they're a little sad today, or oh, this, and then you put them in some type of intervention that really works with that observation, when really it could be just something that maybe the flavor of the day, but you haven't really done a screening or assessment. And so we want to make sure that we're using validated tools, and not just using the tools, but how to actually use those tools and those assessments to make a case plan. A lot of times, Ricardo and I have been out, and they have their case plans, and they've done screenings, and they've done assessments, and it's all there in the file, yet they didn't use that information to actually drive the case plan for the individual. So it's just as important to do an assessment as it is to actually use the data that, that you glean from that. So the term what works is basically bottom line for all the programs. We want to reduce the rates of recidivism for our clients and participants. And I'm going to show you a couple of charts here in a minute that will really drive home some of these things. The PowerPoint has been based on over 30 years worth of research and conducted by different scholars throughout the country, different times, and that's really what you want to look for when you're looking for an intervention, is something that has been replicated multiple times, and so that the outcome that you get should, if you do it to Fidelity, should actually meet the same outcomes that have been shown effective over time. And we want to really move away from just knowing that it works and participants tell us it's working, but actually looking at, as Ricardo was talking about the data earlier, and actually Stacy was talking about the data earlier, is that the more data you collect on these individuals in the based on the screenings and assessments, that you can really hone down whether or not it's actually working for an individual, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. So who here, this is probably, I'm going to not want to ask this question, who here knows what R&R is? Okay, good. So not everybody. So I'm not just, talking and saying, yeah, we know that. So as I said, that this is based on over 30 years of research, and really R&R is called Risk Needs Responsivity, and there's also Fidelity, but that acronym would be NNARF, and I didn't think it sounded all that great. Sounds like Pinky from Pinky and the Brain. So we just call it R&R with Fidelity. And so risk really is who we should be targeting our services to. The need is what we do when we're serving, based on an assessment, what it is that we need to target. Responsivity is how, when we're serving a client or a participant, how they're responding to it and the responsiveness in that intervention, or even the provider. And then Fidelity is how well the services or intervention mirrors the actual curriculum. So the risk principle. Again, lots and lots of research, and I talked Ricardo out of giving you guys the 200+ pages he was planning on having you do first before you even came here, so you can thank me. So risk assessment will tell us who to target and serve, and there's two different types of risk factors. There's static and dynamic. And static are those risk variables that are more malleable, and you can change them with some cognitive behavioral interventions. And dynamic provide the basis of developing a treatment plan. I actually messed that up. Static is those things, I get one, are those things that you can't change, like someone's criminal history or the color of their eyes. And then the dynamic are the malleable ones in which we want to target in order to change their attitudes, values, and beliefs into more pro-social. And there's a couple different things. There's higher risk individuals show antisocial attitudes and values, so they minimalize the criminal behavior that they have not taking responsibility for. Antisocial peer associations, where they're always hanging out with those that get into trouble. They don't finish school, they act impulsively, some have substance use issues, they can't keep employment, and so all those things are things through the interventions that we can change because it's more malleable. So the risk principle looks at who we're treating, and you want to make sure that you're putting the right level of risk individuals in the right types of programs. So placing a low-risk individual into a program sometimes may disrupt their pro-social beliefs and values anyway, because now they're being put into a program and they didn't really have, they were very low risk, but now you're putting them into something that may increase their risk to recidivate. Especially with youth, you put them in a program, it interrupts their school, it interrupts some employment, family has to kind of work their way around some of these interventions. So we really want to put the effort into those moderate and high risk individuals. And it's not saying that low risk individuals don't need some sort of treatment and be held accountable. It's just that when you're don't have a lot of resources, a lot of funding, you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, what you want to do is to treat those individuals that have a higher risk of recidivating. And then there's a dosage piece, which we won't really get into today, but basically that means that higher risk of recidivating, those individuals should receive more dosage of that intervention. So the next slide is one of those I promised you that would really show what it is that I'm talking about. This is from Ohio Community-Based Correctional Facility Study, and it shows the treatment effects on low-risk individuals that are put into a really intensive program. And so reading this chart, it's a little counterintuitive because normally you think, well, if something's above the line, it's better. But in this case, it's not so much. So the positive numbers show the reduction in recidivism, and the negative numbers show increase of recidivism. So if you're looking at this bar graph, the red line is for it's a program KK, I believe. And what it does is that by putting a low-risk individual into more of a high or moderate-risk individual type program, it actually did harm. So it increased the recidivism rate by almost 30%. And the black bar in the middle is an aggregate of all the information there. And still, it would, depending on the different, these are all different types of programs and different types of interventions. But the graph is basically showing that lower risk individuals are being put into higher dosages or interventions that don't really match their need. And still, just aggregating it all together, it increased their rate of recidivism by 4%. And now the next slide actually shows where the individual has been placed in an appropriate intervention into this is the program, the same program, but it's now serving high-risk individuals. So it actually decreased the recidivism rate by 32% by actually matching the right individuals with the right type of intervention. And then all the programs together combined still decreased the recidivism rate by 8%. So doing a good job matching their needs and their risk levels and matching the intervention or the modality of services that you're providing really does matter. And again, driven by data. And the trend for this trend is also very similar to moderate risk, not just high risk individuals. Okay, so now we went through risk really fast, and I'm checking my time, is the need principle. And basically that means that we want to make sure that we're targeting what they really need. And a lot of times when there's a new program in a city or a county, everybody's so excited about it, and they want to put everybody in that program. But you're not matching them necessarily to what they need. And so the need, when you do an assessment, really shows what they need, you need to target. It also will target their criminogenic factors, and that'll make more sense in another slide coming up. And my favorite term by Dr. Latessa is correctional quackery. And sometimes I think it's a little harsh, but it is those things that are not necessarily changing their criminogenic thinking, not changing their behaviors. But they may do a lot and go a long way with other types of components within a program that might help de-stress them. So with no offense to anybody who might be using these things, but drum circles, yoga, PET training. Those are all great things to add as an addition to your programs, but it actually doesn't change criminogenic thinking. Some of those stronger criminogenic risks we talked about, which is antisocial attitudes, values, and beliefs, antisocial peer associations, and those types of things. So this is the we called it the T, and it's looking at what is actually a criminogenic need and what things aren't. But they're all part of different programs that everybody tends to do. So, and not all criminogenic needs have the same weight or value. So that's why there's some above the line and some below, because the top three are the ones that are weighted the most. Those are the ones that you want to put a lot of your resources in, and those top three actually trickle down to the bottom four. So those things that are on the right-hand side that say non-criminogenic needs, those are part of the things that all our individuals and participants in our programs have, but they're not going to reduce recidivism. It may help them holistically, but data has shown over the years that by addressing these things exclusively does not help reduce recidivism. And the best factor for predicting recidivism is criminal history. And so even though it's not listed on here, it's what is considered part of the top 8. And again, it's static, you can't change it, but it is a good predictor of recidivism. So looking at the need principle, based on that, on the left-hand side, the big 7, this slide shows that if you have an individual and you're channeling you're looking at their assessment, then you want to hit at least 4 to 6 of those things on that side to have an impact. If you only look at one of these things on the criminogenic side, and you only address that one thing, you have, basically you're almost having them recidivate a little bit more. And it doesn't matter which one on that side you're using as part of your program, but the theory is that the more you look and use as an assessment and as your curriculum, that you will actually reduce recidivism 31% more, whereas if you basically do nothing and only hit one of those criminogenic factors, it's basically flat. And the greater the needs that are addressed, the more likely it is that their recidivism rate or their recidivism will be impacted. So now we have the responsivity principle, and this one is the easiest way to think about this is how are they going to respond to the intervention, the modality, or even the provider who is giving the services. So cognitive restructuring should be part of all of the programs because that's what's going to reduce recidivism. So a general responsivity principle is that, again, we try to do cognitive, behavioral, and social learning modalities. And you want to match, like if you have someone who is a very weak English speaker, but all your curriculum is in English, and you're hoping that the guy next to them is going to provide that same depth of information you are, most likely is not going to get everything out of it. So in part for the responsivity is not only matching the characteristics from your assessments to what it is that they're going to actually have as part of their treatment plan, but also sometimes matching their personality to the providers. And we all know that sometimes that is something you would love to do. If you had all the resources in the world and all the staff, is match people accordingly to some of their needs. But that just doesn't happen in real life. But if you do have 1 or 2 individuals doing the same intervention, try to use the responsivity factor because you have someone who's really shy and introverted, and then your provider is like just over the top and wants to pull everybody in, and they're not going to get as much out of the program because you're not matching the styles. And there's not a lot of research that is in the responsivity factor as much as the other two. But over the years, they have found that by doing that, it actually increases the outcomes of those not recidivating and also the other components in your programs that you're trying to work with these individuals on. So the responsivity principle is that the interventions are changing their behavior, and you want to make sure that they're action-oriented, that it reinforces pro-social behavior, and that you want to stay away from those interventions or models that do a lot of lecturing, don't getting a lot of off-topic discussions. It's not really structured. So your programs need to kind of reinforce skill development and approaches, if you can, approaches that also include the family unit. Because once they leave your program, where are they going back to? They're going back to the same place that helped them get to where they are. So if you have a component that actually helps train some of the family, then they will respond to the treatment more when they actually have re-entered society instead of being in detention. And this works both not only in detention programs, but out in the environment, out in the community. Okay, so again, with responsivity, the biggest thing is motivation to change. If someone's not willing to change, then you're putting your resources into a bucket and they're just going through the motions. I had a grant once that basically said they had a 100% success rate. And I said, well, what are you doing? Because we need to spread that across to everybody. And they said, well, everybody sat in the chair and came to our intervention and our program. And I said, but what did they get out of it? Did you do a pre and a post? Did you see some change? And they said, we were just so glad they came in the chair. That was a big win for us. It's like, well, that's great, but did you really look to see if the individuals were progressing and hitting those targets that maybe had been set for themselves in a case plan? So you really want to make sure that you look at a lot of different factors. We put gender up here because, again, there's different things that maybe female clients will need differently than male clients. One big no-no is intermixing the genders for program purposes because there are different, like we said, responsivity. If you put someone who has been a domestic violence and have a lot of trauma and they're in a group with a whole bunch of men, that individual is not necessarily going to get the outcomes that both they want and you want for them. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Also, the treatment, as we talked earlier about the Spanish speaking, is that it needs to be culturally responsive to the individual. So again, if they're in a certain program and it doesn't resonate with their beliefs, they're really not going to take all the things that you have to provide to them at heart. And the race and ethnicity, it's correlated with styles of communication. Again, if you had all the resources in the world, you would take them as a holistic individual and plan everything around them. But unfortunately, we kind of got to look at a little more of the totality. And I think that some of you in here have to do with mental or behavioral health programs. So if you've never seen Dr. Jennifer Scheme and want to Google her, one of the best things that I learned a long time ago, well, not the best, but a good thing is that a lot of people think that those that have a mental health issue were only in jail because of that mental health issue. But she has done a big body of research that has actually shown that that's not the case. You may need to stabilize someone, but they still need to have cognitive behavioral therapy to change their attitudes, values, and beliefs because they actually are two separate things. And you can serve them on a parallel track, but those that have mental health issues still need cognitive behavioral interventions. Okay, another fun chart. Okay, so this is the responsivity principle, and it basically illustrates the point that if you do an assessment and match the participant with either an intervention or a provider, you will reduce recidivism by almost 30%. If you don't do anything, you still will reduce a little bit of recidivism, but it's almost as if doing nothing. And also having the addressing whether or not it is a cognitive or a behavioral factor, you can reduce your recidivism more so that way. Now, Fidelity. Am I doing okay, Ricardo? Did he just leave? Okay. Okay. Then let's all change places, so when he comes back, he won't know where you guys are. So the Fidelity Principle is how well the program is following or adhering to the manual or the curriculum that you're using on the individuals, and it's being delivered as designed. And a lot of the Fidelity Principle has to do with modeling behaviors, making sure that the provider is using appropriate behavior, is qualified, is well-trained. And one of the things that I think a lot of people tend to forget is that they get trained in an intervention and they go out and they start providing those services, but then nobody ever follows up to make sure 6 to 8 months to a year later if they're still working on the same curriculum, because we tend to deviate a little bit. And if you get off course, sometimes it's hard to come back. So to have, making sure that if you're a supervisor and you're overseeing either clinicians or a provider, that you pop in every once in a while to make sure that they are going by the manual or the curriculum, because that's one of the most important things, that if you're not following it, your outcomes aren't going to be the same at all. And that the other thing that people tend not to do is they assess someone up front and say it's a 10-month to a year program, and they never reassess them. And so they're working on a case plan that was done probably a very traumatic period or just at the beginning of programming, and they've hit some targets, but maybe we need to relook at those things and actually put them in a different type of intervention instead of where Plan B was or Plan A was. Now we have a Plan B. And I think, as Stacy and Ricardo have talked with you guys, is that to have an evaluator at the very beginning of your program so that they can help you make sure that the things that you're measuring actually are measuring your objectives and your goals that you want. Okay. We've seen too many times where an evaluator comes in at the very end of the program and they have all these data sets, and then they can't do anything with it because it either didn't ask the right questions or it wasn't matched to actually provide measure something, but not for the outcome or the goal that you actually wanted. So the next slide, shows the Fidelity Principle. The blue column illustrates a program that was delivered with fidelity to the model, and the red goes below the line, so it actually was a failure to competently deliver the program and actually increased recidivism rate. So these two programs. Oh, see, I got my 15 minutes. Thank you, John. The Fidelity for a functional family therapy group that was overseen, and another one was aggression replacement training. So this just clearly shows that the more you follow the curriculum and you really are staying on track, not only will you get good outcomes for the individual, you'll actually also reduce their likelihood to recidivate up to almost 40%. And then the same thing is true with the other side of the graph. So here is, as we're hopefully winding down, or I'll do real quick, is adherence to R&R, and this is by a single factor. So if you only use risk, or you only use need, or you only use responsivity, that's on the first side. Under risk, you will only increase your reduction to recidivate by 10%. If you do nothing, it's 3%. If you only address need by doing an assessment and putting their need in their case plan and providing the treatment plan around that, you will reduce their likelihood to recidivate by 19%. And then at the end, responsivity, if you really look to matching, then you can decrease their likelihood to recidivate by 23%. So if you look at the need, if you do nothing or you don't use your assessments appropriately, you could actually do harm. and increase their likelihood to recidivate. Let's see, go to the next page. Okay. And here is when you use either 1, 2, or 3 of those risk, need, or responsivity components. So if you do absolutely nothing, you will actually increase their recidivism rate by 2%. If you use one of those factors, either risk, need, or responsivity, you will change the recidivism rate very slightly. If you use 2 of those, whether it's responsivity and need or need and responsivity, you'll increase their likelihood to not recidivate by 18%. But if you use all 3 of those components, then you have a 26% change in their likelihood to recidivate. I'm not going to go a lot through cognitive behavioral therapy or treatment, but it is, as we've talked about, it's changing their values, attitudes, and beliefs from a criminogenic type thinking to pro-social. And if you think about individuals as kind of an iceberg, and you only see what's on top of the water, and you only look at that and make an anecdotal, non-data decision on what you see, instead of really assessing and looking below the sea level, that's where all the stuff is. And so we need to make sure that we're assessing to get all that information that will help drive a good case plan from below the surface line. So again, cognitive behavioral therapy, all your programming should have a piece of that. Case management plans should have their assessments in there and actually use the data from the assessments. And really, CBT is to looking at identifying and changing their criminogenic thinking and replacing it with more pro-social treatment. And then teaching individuals alternative approaches to managing more difficult situations. So not going right into a role play where they have one of their buddies coming to their house telling them there's a big party down the street at the bar and there's going to be lots of other old buddies there, when that was what kind of got them in the situation they were in. You want to start with something that's a little smaller and a little more simpler so that they can start actually utilizing baby steps in their thinking on how to change how they're going to react to those situations that kind of got them in the situation that they're in. And to, again, like I had mentioned earlier, am I on the wrong page? I am. Sorry about that. That you, I lost my train of thought. So we will go back to that last slide and now go to this one. So we talked about following the manual, making sure that someone is overseeing that process so there's no deviation, that you reevaluate or reassess during the individual's time in your program. These things have all been done over the years by meta-analysis and lots of studies. And if at all possible, to include family members in part of that treatment plan, especially as they're going to have part of their reentry plan, so that when they go back to their environment, they have someone who's supportive and on their side and who actually knows all the things that they've been going through and how to help them continue to maneuver. This is pretty self-explanatory. I want to get through this. Julie, are you hanging up a new sign here in a minute? I got 10 minutes? Oh, good. Another big thing that we always talk about is that individuals in your programs have to role play the scenarios, have to continually try on those new behaviors that they didn't already have. And so the one thing that we saw a lot is that we would go out and they're running the programs and they're going through the homework and exercises, but the individuals aren't trying them on. They're not role playing. They're not seeing how it feels. And so just like athletes in muscle memory, they're going to go right back to the same types of thinking that they did before if they weren't able to try on those things in a safe environment and work through them themselves so that they can have their own set of problem-solving skills once they've re-entered. And a lot of times that will help them also with the motivation, because if you have a behavioral system and that rewards them, whether or not it is a pat on the back, a candy bar, or whatever you have, it helps to motivate them to continue to change their thinking and behaviors. This is real similar to the slide before, where you want to really focus your resources and your energy is on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side are the things that will hopefully come through in other components of your programs, but not the main ones. You want to try to have a ratio of 4 to 1, so focusing on 4 things that will affect criminogenic thinking versus 1 on the right side. And I just talked real briefly about the behavior modification system with your rewards and sanctions. And you can work with Ricardo on some of those things, on looking at a matrix to make sure that it's fair and equitable to all the participants, so that they know exactly what they're, like, could they get an extra pillow if, and this is in detention, if they did these things. And that everybody in the program has the opportunity to receive that same pillow. And having the rewards happens to also encourage and promote behavior change, and then more importantly, increases the long-term pro-social behavior. Skip this real quick. So I mentioned a few of those things: group recognition, pats on the back, maybe certificates, gift cards, different things that will help motivate them to continue to work through the plan that you have for them. So that is really quickly it in a nutshell. The training could be, and not necessarily by me, 3 and 4 hours long, because it really gets into the research behind all of this. And like I said, Ricardo was going to have you read all of that, and I helped you out, and you don't have all that to read. But are there any questions on this really fast presentation about R&R or NARF? Huh? Yeah, so static is, you can't change it. So like their criminal history, you can't change it, but it makes up their who they are. And there's other things that are pro-social or antisocial behaviors, but they're more malleable. So if you can use those to change their values and beliefs and actually criminogenic thinking. Whereas the other one, it is what it is, you know. Anybody else? We have lots of resources for you. So if you want a little bit more in depth, or you know, want some of this, especially some of those graphs that are really telling, when you go back and you have your leadership and you're like, I really want to do this, and if we do this, look at what the chances are. We're going to reduce the recidivism rates, which means we're going to have less people that are coming through the door, and we, you know, can do A, B, and C. So I really advise you to reach out to Ricardo, and we can provide you with more information, if you would like that to share. Is there any other questions? Oh, yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Well, I wouldn't say any, but if you were only to do like that kind of program, it actually doesn't, there's data that shows it does not affect the change in their criminogenic thinking. It might help de-stress them, and it might help them feel like they have a purpose because they are helping train a dog, or for a facility, but it actually does not change their criminogenic thinking. And so you can still do those things, but sometimes there are agencies that will only do that. And so they're really not attaching any cognitive behavioral therapy or treatment to it, where it's helping them navigate the environment once they're out in the community. But it does help with like reducing stress. But that was where I said the 4 to 1. So you can totally do 4 on this side in addressing their criminogenic or their antisocial behaviors. And then the other side, that type of program would help reduce stress or make them feel more apt to communicate in a group because, you know, they have an animal, but it can't be the sole thing. Or the same thing with drum circles or flutes. It's a de-stressor, and it might be a great thing before you get into those interventions, but it doesn't shame the thing. No, not standalone. Oh.
I heard it mentioned when we were doing the introductions, but I just kind of wanted to mention on your list there on the sides that we were supposed to be focusing on, there was a list of certain things that you wanted to focus on, and one of them listed family, right? In a lot of what we do day to day, family isn't always what we think it is, you know? So we were just talking about it earlier, and it came up in conversation even during lunch that it's like a village, you know, it really does take a village. And so it's not like in some instances where we have our cases, we can't go to parents, you know, the parents are not there, you know, so they don't exist. So sometimes it's not family. It's again what we define as family. So I just kind of wanted to make a comment on that because each case is different.
Right, and family really is their community support. So if it's a pastor, then if the program can talk to the pastor and to say, we've been working on this, and this is kind of the language that we've been using, so if you hear this, that's what makes more sense. A lot of times in detention, you know, we want to make sure that the officers are also very aware of the curriculum and the language that's being used, bless you, so that, you know, when they're in their group setting or they're in their intervention, bless you, that they leave that and go back to their unit, that it's also being modeled by the officers, because you know, the more that they can normalize that behavior or normalize that way of thinking and getting rewarded for those positive traits, the better it will be for them on their personal outcomes, but also help reduce the recidivism rate because they can apply that in their community. So yes, thank you. Anybody that is their quote unquote family. Any other questions? Hi, sir. Or so to be more trauma-based intervention. Off the top of my head, I can't, but we can certainly, I'll write that down and Ricardo can get that for you. But yes, besides matching and responsivity to those things, especially these days with sex trafficking and domestic violence, that you really have to look and make sure that the interventions that you're employing are trauma-informed and your providers are trauma-informed in how to look for certain things that aren't necessarily criminogenic, but are part of a different part of the holistic of the individual that you're serving. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wait, that's the break. Sorry.
No, almost.
Not gonna let...
Aubrey, I will add, so we can, and I think we've got your comment, but the University of Cincinnati, when they provided us this training, they did give us some resources, so we can check and see what we have for kind of youth-focused. And my colleague's also working on the California Violence Intervention Prevention Program, or Cal VIP, used to be Cal GRIP. But long story short, I know that we're funding some of those interventions, so I can try to see if we can connect you to those resources as well. Perfect. So I think for me personally, just point of privilege, this is one of my favorite presentations that we get to be a part of, in part because so many of you have CBT built into your existing proposals now. So it's not as if there's a kind of a huge starting point for you. You're familiar with the terminology. On those that I've had the chance to visit, when I say CBT, you just smile and you just kind of go into this lengthy refrain, which is amazing for us because we certainly want to kind of invest in these kind of data-driven approaches. So that's fantastic. And for those of you where, the presentation was maybe the first time you heard some of these concepts and even, hearing about risk, need, and responsivity, we've been trying to do a better job of putting these resources on our website. So know that you can absolutely access this stuff from our website as well.